Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this 8th meeting to comment on the Gospel of John. Let us begin. We must understand how the mystery of Golgotha and therefore of the incarnation of Christ, which is the background and the premise for it to happen, is inserted in a cosmic evolutionary becoming. Rudolf Steiner has already explained this to us from different points of view and according to different dimensions of what happened, both macrocosmically and microcosmically. So, Christ intervenes in evolution when humanity is finally ready to receive this impulse in a fully conscious eye. The Christ comes to incarnate and fulfill the mystery of Golgotha, inserting himself as a further stage in the growth of an organism, we might say. This organism can be seen as humanity, the earth, or the cosmos itself. This moment when the Christ impulse is placed as a further stage in the growth of an organism, in its biography, so to speak, is placed in the 5th post-Atlantean era, the current one, you see it here, but has its origin already in the middle of the Lemurian era, with the Luciferic temptation. From there, it develops throughout Atlantis, until the end of the Atlantean era, when the basis, the physiological and spiritual foundation for self-consciousness, for a fully self-conscious I, finally comes into being and matures. And we know that human beings in ancient Atlantis were very different. We know that the etheric head did not yet coincide with the physical head. Consciousness was still collective and immersed in the forces of the group soul. We know that at the beginning of the first half of Atlantis, humans still had animal traits, which they gradually lost in the second half. Furthermore, we can say that this consciousness, which was floating in the group soul and at the same time did not reach wakefulness as it does today, believed in a dreamlike clairvoyance, was reflected macrocosmically in the atmospheric conditions outside the human being. That is, people lived immersed in a constant fog, with the consequence that the rainbow was not visible in the same way that we see today. Rather, there was a luminous aura in which the colors of the rainbow wove around objects during the day, and in which the Atlantean lived with a twilight consciousness. Forms and colors were not adhering to each other, and Atlanteans did not see distinct contours as we see them now, so that form and color are united. Then, during the night, the Atlanteans awoke, and thanks to their perceptions, their etheric head did not coincide completely with the physical head. Their supersensible perceptions allowed them to encounter the entities of the gods. These were angels and archangels, whom they encountered as absolutely and objectively perceptible entities that remained throughout history and in the history of religions up until before Christ, that is, until the first half of the 4th cultural epoch after the flood. They remained in the memory of polytheistic religions. So, in general, there was a lack of clarity in sensory perceptions. At the same time, however, there was this enormous capacity of the memory and a clear perception of spiritual beings. Clearer than what we have today. So, we must understand that we can never separate. Today, we think we can do so, but in reality, it is an illusion. We can never separate consciousness, the human state of consciousness, and this extends to other living beings, to nature and the kingdoms of nature, though we are talking about this from a human point of view. We cannot separate the state of consciousness that the human, animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms have from the external conditions of the earth, from the atmosphere and the landscape we inhabit. Therefore, atmospheric phenomena such as the first appearance of the rainbow after the flood and the flood itself, as well as the destruction of Lemurian fire and the conditions that existed in Lemuria, are in fact external manifestations of states of consciousness and spiritual transformations between one state of consciousness and another. So when we talk about a certain state of consciousness of, say, the ancient inhabitants of Lemuria, the ancient inhabitants of Atlantis, or after the flood, we are talking at the same time, or we could also describe at the same time, the environmental, atmospheric, and landscape conditions of the earth outside. In particular, at the end of the flood, the rainbow represents the first or one of the first tangible signs that can be experienced even with the outer senses of the separation between spirit and matter, which prepares the ground for the coming of the eye. Also because, as we have said, this rainbow bridge is the connection that is established between the higher I and the incarnated I. So in fact, the same symbol of the rainbow in a spiritual sense means that a ray of the higher solar I has incarnated in the earthly I that was sent to earth. In order to better understand all this, we can delve into the difference between humans and animals with regard to the I consciousness. We know, for example, that animals have a group I, which dwells in the astral world, while in humans, the I descends into the physical world and incarnates in an individual way. In this regard, I will also show you an image that is used in the study of consciousness as a summary, let's say, of studies on consciousness in animals and human beings. So, at the bottom, for example, you see this rainbow, so to speak, which goes from blue to red. Here you find these categories that I'll translate for you. Jellyfish, mollusks, reptiles, most fish, herd animals that live in herds such as herbivores, solitary carnivores, most birds, cephalopods, which are mollusks such as octopuses and cuttlefish. Then you have parrots, dogs, dolphins, elephants, primates, and then monkeys, in particular anthropomorphic ones, and human beings. This is what you see in this series that goes from blue to red, and you see that there are different levels, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth, that indicate what is the field of consciousness that these animals possess, and that it gradually expands. This makes us understand what we were saying from the beginning, that as we move towards those beings that are more and more separated from the environment, the level of consciousness increases obviously in different ways. So we can say that all cold-blooded animals, such as jellyfish, mollusks, reptiles, and most fish, given that their state of consciousness, as we said, states of consciousness in general depend on the conditions of Earth and of Earth's environment, you see that cold-blooded animals tend to have a lower level of individualization. They are more cosmic, so to speak, and their consciousness is more outside them than inside them. Consequently, you see that they reach the second level. The first level is reflex mechanisms, i.e., basic survival reactions. And the second level is more complex behaviors that suggest an increase in sensory awareness. So you see that jellyfish and mollusks belong to level 1, while if we move on to reptiles and the majority of fish, they rise to level 2. There are some differences, of course. For example, if we take crocodiles, we would have to go much higher up the scale, for they resemble the majority of birds, for example. So there are also differences within these groups. And then you see the warm-blooded animals begin, with the exception of cephalopods, i.e. octopuses. But you see that from the green ones, from the cow, that is herbivorous animals that live in herds, up to human beings, you see that you have all warm-blooded animals. So the majority of animals whose consciousness gradually expands are warm-blooded. Why? Because they live well separated from the environment. The heat that other cold-blooded beings must necessarily take from the environment, they produce it themselves. Thus, the more a being acquires a certain autonomy, the more it can actually expand its consciousness. Look also at how, apart from cephalopods, i.e. apart from octopuses, they are all vertebrates, which means that the majority of invertebrates, those that do not have a spine, belong to the side of mollusks and jellyfish, the first two blocks, so to speak. Again, with a few exceptions, because we also know that, for example, bees have a higher state of consciousness, which is close to that of the first representatives of warm-blooded vertebrates, i.e. animals that live in herds in colonies, for example. Then we see the green group, i.e. herbivorous animals that live in herds, solitary carnivores, the majority of birds, and cephalopods. And you can see that we reach level 3, which means greater social communication and parental behavior, parental care. And then we reach level 4, where there is the ability to plan and also to learn. And then we get to level 5 for most birds and also cephalopods, octopuses for instance. And we have a greater behavioral flexibility and the use of tools and a rudimentary language. And then we see how we move on to even more complex behaviors at levels 6, 7, 8, and 9, which can be accessed, for example, by parrots, dogs, dolphins, elephants, primates, anthropomorphic monkeys, and human beings, who represent the greatest breadth of consciousness and therefore also of what? Of separation from the environment. So much so that it also means that as we move towards the last part of this image, in the more intense red, we find beings that are capable of modifying the environment. They are not subjected to the environment as are, for example, on the other side, jellyfish, mollusks, and reptiles. Rather, they affect it. Elephants, primates, and human beings. So if we go up, we have this green part, which are, we said, the first beings that acquire a certain state of consciousness, always in relation to the environment, and gradually we see greater individuation. Cephalopods and octopuses are special because, as you know, they have extremely complex behaviors, given that they are, so to speak, beings that are brain and limbs. So the heart element and therefore the trunk is the least developed in them. But at the same time, they have an impressive connection between their brain, nervous system, and their limbs, which are tentacles. And thanks to this, they can reach very high levels of consciousness. Recently, it has even been discovered that they are able to form colonies. Normally, they're solitary animals, so this is a behavior that has evolved recently. Thus, we can see that the evolution that we observe from a human perspective also applies to animals, which gradually expand their state of consciousness, partly as a result of their interaction with humans. For example, parrots learn complex language from humans, and it is not just parroting. They are able also to recognize the conditions of events in which to use appropriate language, even if it is stereotypical. And even with a certain intonation, a certain caricature, correct emotional coloring. And then, of course, we move on to those we are most familiar with, dogs. And we know how much they're capable of evolving in consciousness. For example, observing the difference between the wild state of stray dogs and domesticated dogs, which acquire many more abilities as a reflection of the light of the eye of the human being. And then we have cetaceans, including dolphins, the ones mentioned here, but largely all cetaceans that have both learning abilities and a complex social life. On land, those with the same abilities, in some ways they're equivalent, are the elephants. From the point of view of intelligence, dolphins and elephants are very similar, except the one is inclined towards the aquatic environment, with what that entails. They are much more focused on sound. For example, they use echolocation, the use of sounds, and group relationships are regulated by sounds. Elephants, on the other hand, regulate group relationships mainly through touch, for example, through their trunks, which they use as a prehensible limb to touch other members of the group. And keep in mind that both of these, dolphins and elephants, have a great memory, both temporal and spatial. So much so that when an elephant dies, a funeral ceremony is held for it, attended by the group, which is matriarchal, following a matriarchal social structure. And they return to the place where these elephants, if they die of old age, go to die, called elephant graveyards, where they go to pay homage to their dead for years and years and years. And then we come to the last two, the primates, the anthropomorphic monkeys in particular, and human beings. If you remember, we said that in reality, from a spiritual point of view, the anthropomorphic monkeys, not all monkeys, but those without tails, which are called anthropomorphic monkeys, are actually delayed human souls in animal or animalized bodies. They are the latecomers of the Lemurian era, who took upon themselves the excess forces of the moon, the delaying forces of the moon, and in some way they sacrifice themselves so that human beings can become human beings. All animals do this, but they do it as a last act, holding back these excess lunar forces for themselves. And then, of course, human beings. Here we see from level 6 those in warm colors, that is, starting with parrots. It says problem solving and more complex social behavior, rudimentary understanding of the desires of other animals and the intentions of other animals. These were the parrots and dogs, always bearing in mind that there are exceptions, that there are some members of these groups who are able to go further. Then we have level 7, to which belong dolphins and elephants, and it says traces, evidence, facts, let's say, of self-awareness and behaviors that are not always connected to survival mechanisms. So, they perform actions, for example, play, that are not necessarily related to survival. But we also know, for example, that dogs and cats do this too. So keep in mind that this is a rough guide. And then we move up to level 8, which is shared by primates and humans, and it says a fundamental theory of mind and more complex behavior that also includes creativity. For example, anthropomorphic monkeys and other monkeys are capable of inventing objects with which to solve problems. Ultimately, human beings who share a complex theory of mind and metacognition, that is, the understanding of other people's cognition of what the other person is feeling, the motivations that drive the other person, or how the psyche of others works. So you understand that if we look at level 9 with human beings and level 1 on the other side with jellyfish, we have the maximum polarity. We have a being that is totally dependent on the world around it, on water, jellyfish that are even carried by the current, and on the other hand, human beings who move towards a totally individual life, that of the consciousness soul, and that gradually enter a social sphere, that of the spiritual self in full consciousness, no longer like animals which live in groups by instinct. Humans also affect their environment, create their own environment. This is due to the fact that the human I becomes completely incarnated in the bodies right down to the physical body, until it finds itself completely separated from the environment around it, at least apparently for the consciousness of the incarnated I, while animal beings, especially cold-blooded ones, are dependent on the circumstances of the environment around them. As they gradually acquire independence, becoming warm-blooded and developing both individual and social behaviors, they're able to progressively detach themselves from their environment. This is because their I, which resides on the astral plane, is more immersed in this astral plane the less animals are individualized. What happens, for example, to the group I of a dog? The group I of a dog that has separated from that of the wolf in the course of evolution, the dog is a transformed wolf, causes these qualities of the I to be gradually bestowed. Let's take dog as an example, because it is the animal we are most familiar with. They are given to the individual representative, who then acquires certain I qualities. It is similar to what we were saying before about us humans, for whom our higher I that lives in the solar dimension radiates its ray onto the earth, and this ray incarnates. In the same way, the group I of the animal which resides on the astral plane sends out its own ray, an offshoot, and instead of giving it to the whole species it governs, concentrates it in a single individual, which is what gradually moves towards individualization. This will only be fully achieved on future Jupiter. So let us say that domestic animals, for example dogs or cats, become more individual than their group I on the astral plane, but never completely. In this process, if you remember, we said that all animals, and therefore all those described here, have a sentient soul that has become incorporated. As with human beings, all animals have a sentient soul that has incorporated itself into their physical body, while only some begin to incorporate the rational, affective, intellectual soul. We can see this rational, affective soul in this diagram at level 5 and level 6. It says, evidence of problem solving, of problem resolution. This is the rational affective soul, which some are able to intercept, as if this rational affective soul were beginning to form within their group soul and brings them progressively closer to those members who acquire a progressively greater individualization. Then, if we go towards 7, 8, 9, we have first 4, 5, 6, in which the rational affective soul gradually manifests. And then with 6, 7, 8, 9, we gradually move from the rational affective soul to the principle of the consciousness soul, which in its completeness is found in the human being. This would be level 9, also called metacognition and complex theory of the mind. This is to understand, as we see here, that the incarnation of the human being and therefore the preparation for the mystery of Golgotha reaches a first culminating moment when the etheric head begins to coincide with the physical head towards the end of the Atlantean era, when the human being has lost its animal traits, leaving to the animals those traits that we have just seen. So the etheric head has come to coincide with the physical head, and at the moment, everything that could not fit, so to speak, in this human being information was given to the animals. In particular, the last act is that of the anthropomorphic apes, which we have said take on all these excess lunar qualities that already, since the Lemurian era, orbitated, so to speak, in human evolution in what would have been man. At this moment, when the etheric body enters the physical head, that is, the etheric head and the physical head coincide, is when the premise for the evolution of individual consciousness arises. up to the current era of the consciousness soul, where we have seen the human being at level 9 of the expansion of consciousness. Why is it so high? Because we can say I to ourselves. This is true self-awareness. And so through this metacognition, we can understand the self-aware I of the other. We can understand that what exists in us also exists in others. Thus, those qualities that would have kept us in a more unconscious, more atavistic state are left in animals and finally in anthropomorphic apes. And on the other hand, self-awareness is prepared, what we know today as consciousness soul. This movement of the consciousness soul that we are experiencing today was already being prepared at the end of the Atlantean era. And the Christ will incarnate at the time in which earthly evolution has created the structure necessary for cosmic I to unite with the human I. Here you see the 7 cultural epochs of civilization. We can see the salient events. In the Polarian era, the first terrestrial era, Sun, Earth, and Moon are still united in a unity. In the middle of the Hyperborean era, the Sun moves away. In the middle of the Lemurian era, the Moon also separates. And we enter the Atlantean era. In the middle of the Atlantean era, the man-animal prevails, that is, man with animal qualities. Gradually, these are brought out in the various animal species, particularly the mammals, which we have also seen. In the last part, the anthropomorphic apes, and we arrive at the etheric head coinciding with the physical head at the time of the Great Flood. This also brings about the separation of air from water and thus the end of the Atlantean mists and the beginning of the post-Atlantean era, which is our own, the 5th. This has 7 cultural epochs. So, we see here the 7 eras of the Earth. Then we see the 7 cultural epochs within the 5th era of the Earth, our post-Atlantean era. And we see the 7 cultural epochs: Indian, Persian, Egypto-Chaldean, Greco-Roman, and Greco-Latin, or Greco-Latin, Anglo-Germanic or European, Russian Slavic, and American. Here, they are called 7 epochs of civilization and 7 periods of civilization, but we call them the 7 eras of the Earth, and within these 7 cultural epochs, for the sake of clarity. These are different translations that have been made over time. Just to be complete, we are in the 5th cultural epoch, the Anglo-Germanic or European, or of the consciousness soul. The Greco-Roman is the epoch of the rational affective soul, the Egypto-Chaldean that of the sentient soul, the Persian of the astral, the Indian of the etheric. Then we move towards the Russian Slavic epoch of the spiritual self and the American of the life spirit, after which we will have the war of all against all, which will be the end of this era, just as the beginning was the flood. And we will enter the era of the 7 seals of the apocalypse, which will be followed by the eras of the 7 trumpets of the apocalypse, which are the 6th and 7th. These are the actual eras of the apocalypse that we will discuss in the next cycle and which we have already commented on in part for the apocalypse. Each era ends with a certain event that we can define as catastrophic, although it is catastrophic in the destructive sense only after the middle of the Lemurian era, because the Luciferic spirits enter. Lemuria ends in fire, Atlantis ends in water due to the entry of Ahrimanic spirits, and our post-Atlantean era ends with the war of all against all, or catastrophe of air, due to the entry of Asuric spirits. This means that what we will experience between the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets will be the catastrophe of the earth, precisely when the earth gradually loses its physical body and leave its soul and spirit in the cosmos, which we call the heavenly Jerusalem. This is how it is described in the Apocalypse. Whereas clearly, since the spirits of the obstacle had not yet entered, at the end of the Polarian and Hyperborean eras, there was a great metamorphosis, but not a real destructive catastrophe. So, now we place the event of the Christ. Here, we see it in terms of cultural epochs. So it is as if we have entered our 5th post-Atlantean era. And we see the cultural epochs which John in the Apocalypse calls with the names of the churches in Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. We call them Indian, Persian, Egypto-Chaldean, Greco-Roman, European, Russian Slavic, and American epochs. You can see that the entry of this impulse of Christ generates a further movement, a further stage of evolution for man, the earth, and the cosmos that occurs about halfway through the 4th cultural epoch, the Greco-Roman or Greco-Latin. You see that it says appearance of the Christ. This endangers the movement to ascend to the Spirit. So descent of the Spirit into incarnation, this arrow that cuts through the cultural epochs, the culmination is reached when the I, fully incarnated and conscious of itself, self-conscious, in the consciousness soul, can progressively unite with that cosmic I that the Christ gave to earth. From there, in our 5th European epoch, an active ascent towards the Spirit can begin. So much so that the 6th cultural epoch of the spiritual self, or we can call it the Age of Aquarius, is also called Epoch of True Christianity or Holy Grail Christianity. As we see here, the Christ incarnate at the point in which earthly evolution has created the structure necessary for a cosmic I to unite with the human I. This is a unique event. If it had happened earlier, human beings would not have been able to contain such a spirit. They would not have had a structure capable of containing it. If it had happened later, human beings would have begun to become excessively rigid in matter. So, the time was ripe for Earth, with its atmosphere and the etheric physical structure of man, to be sufficiently individualized on the one hand, but still malleable enough to receive the Logos on the other. And we know, moreover, that when Christ came in Jesus of Nazareth, not everyone recognized him, even though they still had the possibility of doing so from a purely structural point of view of the etheric physical. But not everyone was able to have this ability to recognize him. They were already too rigid in matter. Hence, myths, such as that of Noah's Ark, Noah who manages to save pairs of animals and his own family from the flood, Steiner says are not fairy tales, but exact memories of cosmic spiritual events. The Atlantean flood marks the end of the era in which collective consciousness and atavistic clairvoyance prevailed. The rainbow that appears at the end of the flood, some of you may remember that we saw it in San Maurizio in Milan, where there was this beautiful fresco depicting various scenes from the flood. The rainbow is the sign of the new covenant, that is, of the possibility for the I to establish conscious connection with the spiritual world. Therefore, the Gospel of John cannot be understood in its deepest sense without initiatory knowledge. And this is where the misunderstanding lies, in not having initiatory knowledge, which, however, today we can gradually develop. The Gospel of John speaks to a consciousness that is gradually transformed by the higher I, the solar I, and so becomes capable of remembering the primordial origin of man and of perceiving the Christ himself as the spirit of the sun. This solar principle that becomes earthly, and of recognizing in the symbols that manifest themselves in nature, such as atmospheric phenomena, animal, vegetable, and mineral symbols, the fact that these are real traces of a spiritual evolution in progress. Thus, we could very well speak of the spiritual evolution in progress, for example, from Lemuria to Atlantis to our post-Atlantean era, through the study of fossils, as is done in paleontology, because those same fossils of animals, plants, but also the rocks found in minerals, correspond to a fossilized image of the state of consciousness that man and all other kingdoms of nature were going through. So, to give just one example, when Steiner talks about, for example, the Luciferic spirits, which are represented by the serpent, what took place in the Lemurian era corresponds on Earth to the Mesozoic era, which is the era of the great reptiles. Just as the Luciferic spirits exist in the spiritual astral atmosphere of the Earth, on Earth existed the great reptiles, the earthly image of these Luciferic spirits. And the same is true when Steiner tells us that human beings, who still had this large supersensible part of their being in the Lemurian era, were giants. What do we have in the Atlantean era that follows the Lemurian era, that is, the era of the great reptiles? The dinosaurs. What came after their extinction? In the following era, we have the great mammals, the giant mammals. So you see that we are used to telling the story in a certain way, which is clearly correct. But we could also see it from the point of view of animals, plants, and minerals as bodies of the earth. The same spiritual evolution. So, the Gospel of John invites us, given that in the Gospel of John the Christ is recognized as Spirit of the Sun that becomes Spirit of the Earth, and planet Earth becomes his body, it invites us to recognize the symbols that manifest themselves in nature. Atmospheric phenomena, animal, plant, and mineral symbols, as real traces of an ongoing spiritual evolution. In the final epoch of Atlantis, which ends with the Great Flood, which is the ancient astrological era of Leo, we can observe, as we saw in the previous course of the Egyptians, the migration to Asia of the nucleus of the next era, our post-Atlantean era. This was led by Manu, the guide of humanity. And we see this here. We also saw this image in the previous seminar. In this image, you can see Atlantis in the center of the present Atlantic Ocean. Briefly, we see Saturn, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter. These are the main oracles of Atlantis. And you can see the migration currents. Let's talk about Saturn first because it is on its own. And Steiner will talk about it in a cycle on the mysteries of Mexico in particular, connecting it to the Templars in Golgotha, the event of Golgotha and the Knights Templar. Do you see that it migrates to the Americas? The heirs of the Atlantean oracle of Saturn moved to North America and South America. The thinner red squares are the remains of primordial Lemuria, of the oldest part, while the thicker red squares are the remains of the later Lemurian era. So in general, in red you see Lemuria. And the oldest Lemurian era is in South America and Africa, in Southern Africa. Then you see other oracles, those of Venus and Mercury and of Jupiter. They are located west of present-day Ireland, and they are divided into two currents. One is that of Venus and Mercury, which are two different oracles, but which are found parallel to each other, north and south of the Mediterranean. The Venus current passes to the north, and the Mercury current passes to the south, meaning that from Atlantis, after the flood, they head towards Europe, the Mediterranean. The Venus current passes from the north and the Mercury current passes from the south, but they join in the area near the Caucasus, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, near Iran. This is the current of the mysteries of the South, or microcosmic, which are also those of Egypt. Above, you can see the oracle of Jupiter. In green, we have seen Venus and Mercury. In blue, Jupiter. And you can see these currents, some of which arrived directly in Portugal and Spain, and then spread across Central Europe. The other one passes through Ireland, Ibernia, the primordial island, then England, and then it enters Europe. From there, it proceeds through the northern part of Europe, then into present-day Russia, in the Caucasus, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and then continue with the current that reaches Tibet, the Himalayas, returning into Iran. In Iran, the southern and northern currents begin to converge. This northern current is also the one that will bring about the Paleo-Indian epoch, passing through Asia Minor. In Asia Minor, the two currents, north and south, the northern mysteries are those of the Druids originally, therefore macrocosmic, while those of the south are microcosmic, will meet in a first union. The currents that descend southwards below the equator will encounter the remains of Lemuria, the civilizations you see in red. This is a diaspora, and dispersion after Atlantis, after the flood of Atlantis, and you see the sun in yellow, including Manu. You see that there are three arrows. One is the Manu of the north, one is the Manu of the south, and then you see another Manu descending even further south, who accompanies those peoples who will arrive in America, the Oracle of Saturn. You see it here where the sun is. The Manu of the north is what we call Lug, with the story of the Tuatha De Danann, who are the original people of Hibernia Island. The Manu of the south, on the other hand, is what we know as Noah. So, near present-day Ireland, to the west, you see it here as the north of ancient Atlantis, there was a region which today is submerged that was particularly favorable in a spiritual and evolutionary sense. Here a people developed who were destined and gifted for self-awareness. This chosen group is the so-called primordial Semitic people, and they were led by a great initiate Manu, who is the spiritual founder of the peoples of the post-Atlantean epochs. This advanced nucleus migrated spiritually and physically toward Central Asia, bringing with it the seed of future civilizations, with one pole in particular establishing itself and continuing today with almost uninterrupted continuity, obviously with modifications, but remaining spiritually uninterrupted, in Tibet. Meanwhile, the landscape and human conditions were undergoing a radical transformation because the western regions of Atlantis were submerged, while Europe and Asia gradually emerged, and the less evolved populations dispersed throughout Europe and Asia, themselves encountering the remnants of the Lemurian population. This created a spiritual diversification of the new peoples. So, as the new peoples descended southwards, they joined the populations that had inherited Lemurian spirituality, and thus more evolved peoples joined with peoples who had remained in more primordial conditions. The impulse that was brought by the oracle of the sun, which remained uninterrupted, is the one that will go on to found the Paleo-Indian epoch. It is de facto what will be the bearer of the new impulse of our post-Atlantean epoch. So, the first civilization to bring the new spiritual impulse after the flood was the ancient Indian civilization. It was inspired by the great solar initiate Manu, the Manu of the south. The Manu had 7 disciples, the 7 holy rishis, who were clairvoyant masters and bearers of the spiritual wisdom of Atlantis. They preceded, so to speak, in a spiritual sense, the entire Vedic culture of the Vedas known historically. Therefore, at the foundation of the Vedas are the 7 holy rishis, who had in their etheric bodies the spiritual wisdom of the 7 oracles of Atlantis. In Atlantis, we also know that there was no religion in modern sense, because man lived in communion with the spiritual world through nature, the Tao, the creative word that resounded in the mists of Atlantis, in nature. The Atlanteans did not need to believe in the gods because they saw them clairvoyantly. But from the holy rishis onwards, it became necessary to impart a religion that was a memory of the ancient Atlantean religion. So the Atlantean populations still had a twilight clairvoyance, as we have said. Man did not yet have a clear daytime consciousness, and the etheric was still partially outside the physical body, particularly of the head, and this allowed a direct view of the spiritual world, especially during sleep. On the other hand, the Atlanteans had a hazy view of the physical world. The sensory world appeared indistinct and shrouded in fog. Thus, figures of gods, such as the gods of the north, Wotan and Thor, this is an example by Steiner, were not invented myths, but real beings, real spiritual entities seen clairvoyantly. And so the Norse sagas and the Greek myths, for example, are remnants of real experiences with spiritual entities, and we might say, their relationships. In the transition from the Atlantean era to the post-Atlantean era, the ancient mysteries of Europe and then of Asia were founded, thanks to the continuity with the mysteries of Atlantis. There are two currents: the mysteries of the North and the mysteries of the South. You can see them here, the North in blue and the South in green. The mysteries of the North are the mysteries of the Druids, who were Celtic, and their Scandinavian equivalent, the Drotters. So Druids and Drotters, Celts and Scandinavian. They preserved in Europe the Atlantean wisdom, therefore initiatory knowledge, but also a certain atavistic Atlantean state of consciousness, keeping alive the link with the spiritual world. Many of those in the northern current, i.e. Druids and Drotters, Celts and Scandinavians, still had direct experiences of the gods and spirits of elemental beings in dreams or altered states of consciousness. It was a macrocosmic path. We must bear in mind that in general, among the ancient peoples of all currents, both in America and in the American Saturn current, and in the currents of the North and South, which then spread from Northern Europe and in the Mediterranean towards Asia, the use of substances during initiation ceremonies was expected. Substances that allowed the state of consciousness to be altered and the etheric body to be relatively freed from the physical body, and at the same time allowed the astral to be powerfully permeated by the cosmic astral world. Thus, substances were used that we would today call psychotropic. So these substances were used indiscriminately in all the ancient mysteries in different forms and different substances that we will not specify here, and therefore with specializations depending on the spiritual current to which they belonged. For example, Saturn, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and so on. The southern current is the one we find in the mysteries of the Mediterranean. To give two examples, in Egypt the mysteries of Osiris, Isis and Horus, and in Greece the mysteries of Eleusis. This was a microcosmic path in which priests always had this atavistic connection and initiatory knowledge of Atlantis, but it was not a path that was practiced outdoors in contact with the forces of nature and elemental beings, but inside structures, temples, so to speak, which allowed for the same experience. In the northern path, initiation was reached by expansion into the cosmos. In the southern path, on the other hand, there was a deepening into the depth of what we call the unconscious, the soul. So, macrocosmic path of the north and microcosmic path of the south. The initiation of the northern path of the Druids and Drotters took place outdoors in contact with the forces of nature. Those of the southern path came with what we call mystical death, being closed for 3.5 days in a structure, let's say a sarcophagus in a broad sense, while they remained for 3.5 days in a state close to death. In this way, whether it be the northern path or the southern path, and also in the Americas, religion was born. Religion is what emerged in an imaginative form from the experiences of the ancient mysteries. So the founders of religions are initiates of the ancient mysteries who translated those experiences that they could not have all peoples or members of the population experience because they were not prepared, and brought them instead in an imaginative form, in the form of images, stories, what we call myths, the sagas of the gods of antiquity, religion. So religion arises when man gradually loses direct contact with the spiritual world. And in fact, the term religion means to bind together again, to reconnect. To reconnect to what? To the deities. The initiates were already reconnected because they still had this ability to perceive the spiritual, and it was reawakened through initiation. The majority of the population did not, so they had to be given cults in which to cultivate myths and images that allowed them to reconnect and reconcile themselves with the deities. In Atlantis, in fact, all this was not really necessary in this way because spiritual beings were experienced and not believed. The difference, if anything, was in the degree to which they were experienced. So the hierophants, the oracles of Atlantis, the adepts, and the initiates of Atlantis experienced them to the maximum extent possible, so to speak. The peoples of Atlantis experienced them in a more twilight state. However, they did not need to be given a myth, a story. This only appeared after Atlantis, with religion as the fruit of the initiation in the ancient mysteries from the part of the initiates and founders of religions. Post-Atlantean man, after the flood, that is, modern human beings, acquired the clear and alert daytime consciousness typical of the present world. But this progress has a price. Human beings have lost their natural clairvoyance, that is, the ability to perceive the spiritual world directly, as was the case in Atlantis and Lemuria. The progress from the 4th to the 5th era consists in losing the ancient clairvoyance and in gradually acquiring clear waking consciousness up to our time, so that from clairvoyance and senses directed towards the spiritual, we pass to clear thinking and senses directed towards the sense physical. We have also said that the most evolved of the post-Atlantean human beings, guided by Manu, were led eastwards to Tibet, where the first post-Atlantean civilization, the Paleo-Indian civilization, was formed. You can also see this here in the image. These human beings guided by Manu were more advanced because they had almost completely lost their atavistic clairvoyance, but they were able to develop it consciously through initiatory discipline. In this Paleo-Indian era, the dominant feeling was nostalgia for the lost spiritual world. And this inspired the ancient sagas and the myths of the Vedas that you find in the Vedas, and was also the basis of the initiatory method of yoga, which means union. The term yoke has the same origin as yoga, a yoke that unites. This was understood as a conscious return to ancient states of consciousness. The initiation obtained in the Paleo-Indian epoch through the practice of yoga was a return to clairvoyance. This is the original initiatory yoga, in which, through holding what we call asanas for a prolonged time, a state of deep or lethargic sleep was induced for 3.5 days. So imagine that an asana was held for 3.5 days. In this state, the etheric body detached itself more and more from the physical body, and the astral body could thus imprint itself. It could live, so to speak, in this cosmic dimension and imprint these cosmic experiences in the etheric body upon awakening. Thus, upon awakening, by releasing the asana, the initiate of this initiatory yoga consciously remembered what he had experienced in the spiritual worlds. Thus, instead of imitating death in the grave, so to speak, for 3.5 days, a position was assumed in a natural environment. An asana was assumed in a natural environment that corresponded to that asana. For example, a mountain in a mountainous area. Just an example. And that asana became the door through which the astral body was imprinted with cosmic forces. One reconnected with the gods, the etheric body withdrew from the physical body. The astral body re-entered and imprinted this experience on the etheric. The etheric re-entered the physical body, and one remembered consciously what had happened. For the Paleo-Indian civilization, the physical world is pure illusion, Maya. Therefore, reality, the true reality, is spiritual. It followed that the material world is worthless in itself and serves only as a veil to be overcome through this yogic initiation. The holy man, therefore, is he who withdraws from the sense world to find the lost reality of the spiritual worlds. This is the first cultural epoch, also called the Church of Ephesus. In the second cultural epoch after the flood, the Paleo-Persian civilization takes a further step in the relationship with the sense-physical world. The physical world is no longer simply avoided, as the ancient Indian did, but experienced as a battlefield. Cosmic dualism is born. The awareness of cosmic dualism between the spiritual forces of light, Ahura Mazda or Ormazd, and the spiritual forces of darkness, Angramanius or Ahriman. At this point, the ancient Persian does not deny Maya, but confronts and transforms it, bringing light into darkness and thus illuminating it. In ancient Persia, the journey of man began works in matter, not to escape it, but to redeem it. And this was also called the Church of Smyrna. The third cultural epoch is that of the Chaldeans, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians, also called Church of Pergamum, where an important step is taken by humanity towards the physical world. The previous civilizations, the Paleo-Indian and the Paleo-Persian, of which no written trace remains, the first written traces are found in the third cultural epoch, are prehistoric in this sense, occurring before written historical documents, whereas the previous Paleo-Indian and pre-Persian civilizations saw the material world as Maya, an illusion to be transcended. Ancient Indians, or fought against ancient Persians, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians began to explore and penetrate it spiritually. This Chaldean, Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, or Egypto-Chaldean civilization, if you want to use one name for all of them, is a phase of spiritualization of the relationship with matter, and therefore of matter itself. In particular, there is a polarity. The Chaldeans developed astronomy, astrology or astronomy, for them it was the same thing, that sought to read the writing of the gods in the sky, the star script. On the other hand, the Egyptians with geometry began to study nature and the earthly world. So you have the Chaldeans looking upwards towards the heights, the macrocosm, astrology, astronomy, and the Egyptians who, on the other hand, focus in particular on geometry, studying nature, the earthly world, and also developing architecture in a more evident way. Obviously, neither denied the other's dimension, so the Chaldeans were also involved in building, but they were much more interested in celestial motions, whereas the Egyptians, even though Egyptian architects were very capable of building, built in such a way that those sacred structures corresponded to the star script of the gods, that is, of the heavens. But we can already see that there is a difference, and man begins to read the physical world as a sacred text, the great book of nature, as the Rosicrucians call it, which reveals divine thoughts. So the Chaldean study of the stars and the Egyptian study of earth are forms of spiritual knowledge that is not yet materialistic. Rather, they are sacred sciences. A particularly interesting evolutionary step in the third cultural epoch is the connection, the development of which we can still appreciate today between the practice of mummification and the sense of personal I among the Egyptians. The Egyptians wanted to preserve the form of the physical body beyond death in order to permanently fix the personality. This attachment to form produced, in subsequent reincarnation, a stronger consciousness of the personal I, and therefore of personality, that we find in humanity today. This tendency, when taken to extremes in today's world in an Ahrimanic and therefore entirely materialistic sense, becomes the desire to preserve the physical form of the body beyond all measure, and to acquire Ahrimanic immortality, the immortality of the physical body. And it is also fear of death, an underlying fear of death. Here, then, in this example, we see how the actions and symbols of previous epochs, which have played a role in evolution even in a regular way, determine the inner attitudes and relationships with the world of subsequent epochs, in a karmic bond that is inherited from one people to another through cultural epochs. In particular, we know this is true of the ancient Egyptians with the Italian people. So, the cult of mummies in Egypt, the cult of physical form, laid the foundations for modern self-awareness. Here, Steiner highlights a paradoxical condition that we experience, namely that the modern age has required immense spiritual forces to build infrastructure in telecommunications, the telegraph, railways, and global trade. Today, we would also add the internet, large servers, hydroelectric power stations, nuclear power stations, and so on. But all this spiritual effort has been used for selfish and material purposes, without a corresponding real inner growth. So we are living in a fracture, in a crisis in which we have enormous capacities to dominate matter in the physical sense, but very little capacity to delve into the moral consequences of such innovations, of such domination of matter. Thus, in most cases, we do not bring moral forces through these means, but immoral forces. So much so that on other occasions I have said, look how empty, it is obviously an image, look how empty the churches are, the Christian places of worship, and look instead how full the large companies are, power stations, for example, for energy production, or the servers. Look at how real churches of Ahriman are being built. So when you look, for example, at a place where energy is produced, a nuclear power station, that is an equivalence, just as churches exist and are being built, and there have been temples for the gods and the church for Christianity, you also find the Church of Ahriman. They are all, in quotation marks, temples for technology, where technology prevails over humans. In reality, we have to say that in this case, Ahriman is doing us a favor, of course, because we do all this. We walk through a computer, we talk through a computer, we hear each other from one side of the globe to the other, thanks to the forces of Ahriman. But what is the problem? The problem is that we allow ourselves to be dominated by what we create under the impulse of Ahriman. So we allow ourselves to be dominated by technology, and instead of giving it a moral meaning, sending moral forces through the technology that allows us to dominate space-time and matter more and more, we send immoral forces because we do not evolve spiritually. We do not concern ourselves with our spiritual evolution, where instead, thanks to Ahriman's giving us convenience, we could devote a great deal of energy to spiritual evolution. By giving ourselves the convenience of technology, we could devote much more energy to inner evolution. This is the paradox of our modern civilization. Our civilization is capable of exerting a powerful influence in matter and space-time, but it is devoid of spiritual wisdom and struggles to develop its own morality, its moral forces, which is our task on Earth. So be careful. Steiner never denies progress. That is, he does not say that we should not progress externally, but he warns us that its purpose is currently limited to selfishness and materialism. This desire for power that we have over matter and space-time, for some even extends to others, to the oppression of others, and even to the destruction of nature. Moreover, incidentally, the main enemies of the Ahrimanic spirits, in a certain sense, besides free human beings, are living beings. Wherever there is a prevalence of Ahrimanic forces, first of all, we observe the subjugation of human beings to a dominion, to a power, namely economic power. And secondly, we observe the destruction of the environment, precisely because these spirits are hostile. To what? To the creation that the Elohim have brought about, because they want to become like our new Elohim, false gods. In ancient civilizations, instead, kings and priests were always initiated into the mysteries. Initially, kings and priests in ancient times were priest kings who were one and the same figure. Only later did these two figures split, but remained in a polarity. And as long as the priest kings were initiated into the mysteries, it was known that the laws of heaven had to be reflected in those on earth. So the decisions that were taken in the social sphere were inspired by the stars, by the star script, or by the messages they received from nature, from earth. Therefore, a more macrocosmic path and a more microcosmic path, one more celestial and one more terrestrial, in what was a true cosmic harmonization. So there was, we could say, let's use a big word, a sacred politics, an administration, let's say, of the common good, which followed the language of the cosmos and the earth. So kings and priests, and even more so the primordial priest king, whoever ruled had to know the spiritual laws of the cosmos, the priest king, the kings, and priests. In fact, at the beginning of the fourth cultural epoch, the Greco-Roman one, the church Thyatira, with the foundation of Rome, this principle was still in place. So much so that Steiner tells us, as we saw in our Roma Amor, our trip to Rome, that Roman history was traced in advance, prophetically, in the ancient mysteries. In particular, it was preserved in the Sibylline books. The location of the Sibylline books moved several times throughout different temples in Rome. But finally, the last location they took in Rome was where what we call the state archives would later be built, which is a sort of highly externalized image of the equivalent Sibylline books of antiquity. In particular, the founding culture of Rome is the culture of Alba Longa, whose name indicates that white priestly robe, which is called alba, meaning white tunic, longa, meaning long. Long white tunic, precisely a civilization of king priests. And the 7 kings of Rome, who were predicted in the Sibylline books, were therefore prophetic figures, not just historical, but also spiritual figures. So much so that we have talked about them in the sense of the seven bodies, from the physical body to the spiritual man. I'm referring to our journey to Rome, so if you're interested, you can learn more there. This is how external history is a realization in time of spiritual archetypes that can be known in advance by those who have access to the supersensible dimension of the spiritual worlds, i.e., the initiates. What happens again in the fourth Greek-Roman cultural epoch? That human beings project themselves into the external world. Within itself, culture is divided into two parts, the Greek part and the Roman part, and we obviously use this distinction to better understand. These two movements are intertwined. With Greek culture, which prevails in the first half, human beings begin to objectify their inner nature, that is, to see themselves outside themselves. How? Through artistic and cultural forms, such as the foundation of the Greek polis. The Greek gods are therefore externalized images of human beings themselves, who conceal their own form in the representation of these divine figures. In fact, in Greek myths, why are Greek myths so well suited to the study of human psychology? Think, for example, of Jung, of Freud himself, with the myth of Oedipus, but Jung even more so, and then even more so, Hillman, a disciple of the Jungian school. Why? Because in reality, these gods, who are human, too human, are in fact thoughts, feelings, and volitional impulses of men laid bare outside. So much so, in fact, that in the various temples where the cult of the deity was practiced, the faithful took on those thoughts, feelings, and volitional impulses that corresponded to that deity, and in the simulacrum of the deity, in the statues, there was a perfect archetypal human form. Furthermore, in the dramatic art of Aeschylus, the desire to value human individuality emerges, and Greek art, which represents the deities in human form, is a symbolic image of this evolutionary process. Let us move on to Rome, the second part, where it prevails, and then we come to the end. Within the culture of Rome, the projection of the human being who objectifies its own inner nature shows up, above all, in the state and in legal institutions. When the spiritual baton is passed from Greece to Rome, one has the impression that the Greek gods have descended into concrete life. Where did the ancient Romans, especially the nobles, the gens romana, get their customs? For example, being robed in a toga as members of the Catholic Republic. These customs are taken from the Greek gods. So the Greek gods descended into incarnation, and what were priestly garments, even those used in Greek temples, were taken up as the garments of rulers of the various dimensions of the government of Rome. This symbolizes the progressive rooting of individual consciousness in the social, legal, and political dimensions. The individual personality becomes concrete and legally recognized through the Roman citizens as a subject of law. So, Steiner's consideration is right. We said earlier that the ancient laws of the third cultural epoch are all divine laws transferred to earth. So the idea that a human right similar to Roman law existed before Rome, before Latin culture, is false. Before Latin culture in Rome, there was no legal concept of the individual as such, and therefore no concept of the state as such. There were divine laws, so human laws appeared with Rome, and these are the laws that still govern us today. In this four cultural epoch, the consciousness of the individual in the sense of personality is consolidated. Human beings have finally descended to understanding matter, to the wedding of Maya with the spirit. So at this point in the Greco-Roman epoch, man is no longer afraid of Maya, no longer wants to flee from her. On the contrary, the Greeks adorned her with beauty through art, and the Romans, the Latins, dominated her with power. Thus, and this is Steiner's premise that he set at the beginning, this is the moment when finally it will be possible to conceive of divinity as a personal being, a god within a human body, something that had never existed before. So, the Greek epoch with art, the Latin epoch and impulse with politics, the state, laws, it was absolutely necessary that all this be established on earth, particularly in the Mediterranean and later in the Middle East, in what we call Palestine, the Holy Land, where Greek and Roman cultures met with Jewish and many other cultures. All this was necessary so that the Christ could incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth. So the incarnation of the Christ at the baptism in the Jordan took place precisely in this epoch, which is at the heart of post-Atlantean evolution, when Greek culture had adorned the world of beauty. Roman culture had dominated it with power, and Jewish culture had brought the consciousness of the I in prophetic form. Obviously, behind these are the Egyptians, clearly the Egypto-Chaldean culture that prepared the whole environment in which this took place. So we can say the Middle East, all the many cultures of the third cultural epoch, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Chaldeans, and so on. So Greco-Roman civilization prepared this event because it is the epoch when man is individualized enough to understand a personal God incarnate, when God finally takes on the countenance of man, which, if you remember from the previous seminar on myths and mysteries of Egypt, was the ancient meditation that the Hierophants of Atlantis gave to their disciples. Meditate on the countenance of man, and in doing so, everything that is animal will flow out of you, and you will become more and more human, a true human being. This is completed when God, the solar spirit, the Christ, incarnates in Jesus of Nazareth, that is, takes on the countenance of man. The Christ is the manifestation of the solar spirit, which becomes earthly and becomes personality. Thus, Christ Jesus appears as the personalization, that is, the assumption of the person. Person is a term used, for example, to refer to the persons of the Trinity, but also in Greek theatre, where it means sound that amplifies, relating to the masks worn in Greek theatre that represented the protagonists of Greek tragedies, including the gods. So Christ Jesus appears as the assumption of the person of the Spirit, which from solar becomes earthly at a time when man, the human being, is ready to understand it within the personality. Those whose personalities have become too earthly will not recognize him. Those who, on the other hand, were still not too far down in matter and at the same time had detached themselves from the group soul will be able to recognize him, as was said in the previous lecture. The individual consciousness thus attained in this fourth period, this fourth cultural epoch, prepares what will come in the subsequent cultural epochs, with an evolution that will gradually unfold and that we are experiencing today in its unfolding. Thus, we had, for example, all the events after Christ in the first 13 centuries. This is when the saints appear, as well as the mission of Mani, founder of Manichaeism, the mysteries of King Arthur, then those of the Grail, those of Lundgren, the Knight of the Swan, and so on, up to the present day with Theosophy, Anthroposophy, and all spiritual movements. So beyond the Christ incarnated in the physical body of Jesus of Nazareth, right down to the physical body of Jesus of Nazareth, in the fourth cultural epoch, there is the risen Christ, the etheric Christ, who is the Christ in his manifestation now, in our fifth cultural epoch of the consciousness soul after the resurrection. Subsequently, we will have the astral Christ of the sixth cultural epoch and the spiritual Christ of the seventh cultural epoch, until the war of all against all.